here at the U.S. Institute of Peace of the Asia Center. I'd like to welcome you all today to this timely and important discussion with the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, John Sopko, and an excellent panel of experts to launch SIGAR's latest Lessons Learned report on reintegration of ex-combatants in Afghanistan. I'd also like to welcome all of you who are joining us online for the webcast, and would note that you can also follow the conversation on Twitter at USIP with today's hashtag SIGAR. That's at USIP hashtag SIGAR, S-I-G-A-R. I'd also like to encourage you to check out USIP's new podcast network at usip.org/podcasts, which will include this event and many other compelling programs featuring leading voices on violent conflict prevention and national security. USIP was founded 35 years ago by members of Congress as an independent, nonpartisan national institute charged with vitally important mission of preventing, mitigating, and resolving violent conflict. Since 2002, our Afghanistan program has worked closely with the Afghan and U.S. government and with civil society organizations and others to prevent and mitigate violent conflict, and more recently, to support the Afghanistan peace process. It goes without saying that there's considerable uncertainty during the last 2 weeks in terms of whether the Afghanistan peace process, but while that remains true, what is certain is that the topic of today's conversation on reintegration of ex-combatants is going to remain highly relevant if and when we get a peace process, and we certainly hope that will be sooner rather than later. The report we are launching today is the 7th report by SIGAR's Lessons Learned program. USIP is pleased to have had the opportunity to launch some of the earlier versions here as well. The report is the first and only U.S. government study to comprehensively examine all post-2001 Afghan reintegration programs and assess their effectiveness. We have an excellent panel lined up today with distinguished panels on Afghanistan, which will be moderated by Scott Warden, our director of our Afghanistan and Central Asia programs. But first, I have the pleasure of introducing the Inspector General, John Sopko, to provide the keynote address. John Sopko was sworn in as the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction by President Obama on July 2nd, 2012. He has over 30 years of experience in oversight and investigations as a prosecutor, congressional counsel, and senior federal government advisor. In addition to working for an international law firm, he has worked on Capitol Hill for over 20 years, where he held key positions in both the Senate and House of Representatives. Please join me now in welcoming Inspector General Sopko to the stage.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and good morning to all of you. And a special thanks, obviously, to the Institute of Peace. We have worked with them for years that I've been at the SIGAR, and we hope that relationship continues. I stand here today at an interesting time in the current chapter of our nation's longest war, which in a few weeks will be marking the 18th anniversary of it. In my 7 years at the SIGAR, I have learned at least one thing, and that is never underestimate the utterly unpredictable nature of matters regarding Afghanistan. And I think you will agree with me, the past few weeks only have underscored that point. But the subject today is the reintegration of ex-combatants in Afghanistan. And that will and is relevant to Afghans' future and American national security interests, no matter what happens in Afghanistan and the United States over the time to come. For if there is ever to be a true, sustainable peace in Afghanistan, reintegration of the Taliban and other combatants will be a necessary component of that process. Again, whether that occurs in days or years from now. That is why today's report by SIGAR, we believe, is so important. It is the first independent, public, official U.S. government report on the trials and tribulations of integrating the Taliban and other combatants into the Afghan society. Today's publication, as was mentioned, is our 7th Lessons Learned report, and I believe we have a document that we've handed out which links you to all 7 reports. We began this Lessons Learned program, and I should say that Scott Warden led it for a while until he came back to the Institute of Peace. But we began that program at the urging of then General John Allen and former U.S. Ambassador Ryan Crocker, as well as other senior government officials who reminded us that our agency was the only U.S. government agency with the mandate to look at the whole of government and the whole of government's efforts in Afghanistan. Like the 6 prior reports, today's report is available both in traditional and interactive format on our website, www.sigar.mil. And I believe of the 70 inspectors general who operate in the United States government, we are the only one that actually puts our reports out in an interactive format. Now, SIGAR undertook this specific investigation, or this project, I should say, in part because in spring of 2018, when I was traveling to Kabul, senior U.S. military and diplomatic leaders in Kabul expressed an interest in knowing more about what worked and what didn't work in integrating combatants. We also recognize that the body of literature on what practitioners call DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, deals more with the 2 Ds than the R, reintegration. We also viewed reintegration as an appropriate topic because large-scale disarmament of combatants in Afghanistan is generally not seen as foreseeable in the near future. Now, the goal of today's report is to help U.S., Afghan, and other coalition policymakers and agencies as they prepare for that daunting task of assisting with the reintegration of approximately 60,000 full-time Taliban fighters, as well as numerous other non-Taliban combatants, in the event that the Afghan government and the Taliban enter negotiations to reach a peace deal. The report, which ironically actually started 14 months ago today, relies on 51 interviews of current and former U.S., Afghan, and other government officials and academics, a review of thousands of pages of public documents and academic material, as well as a rigorous peer review. And in that regard, I am grateful to former U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, James Dobbin, as well as Dr. Dede Dirksen, a scholar on Afghanistan and the DDR, as well as others who peer-reviewed this report. We really do appreciate their work. We also appreciate the many officials of the Departments of Defense, State, Treasury, and USAID who also provided valuable insight and feedback. While this report is a SIGAR product, it is really a collaborative effort of all of them. In that report, we outline 14 findings, 10 lessons, and make 15 recommendations for policymakers. But in an effort to keep my remarks a little shorter than the peace negotiations, I am going to just highlight a few of the major takeaways from that report. First of all, as we all know, the stated U.S. goal in Afghanistan is sustainable political settlement between the Afghan government and the Taliban that brings lasting peace and stability to that country. There has been hope that a U.S.-Taliban deal would open the door to an intra-Afghan peace process, which could eventually lead to a peace agreement. Now, while there is no U.S.-Taliban deal at this time, let alone an intra-Afghan political settlement, the ongoing fighting hasn't stopped the U.S. and other donors from supporting reintegration efforts over time. Our team's close examination of those efforts led to our first recommendation, and that is, as long as the Taliban insurgency continues, the U.S. should not, and I repeat, not, support a comprehensive program to reintegrate former fighters because of the difficulty in vetting, protecting, and tracking former fighters. This report, as I mentioned, examines the 5 main post-2001 reintegration efforts in Afghanistan and assesses their effectiveness or lack thereof. Further, it examines several past local security arrangements and whether they provided an opening for real reintegration. The report also examines opportunities and constraints for reintegration efforts now and in the future, including case studies of reintegration in Colombia and Somalia, as well as reviewing the broader literature on reintegration. Our review of all of these efforts found, however, that any major reintegration effort is very likely to fail in the absence of an agreement between the Afghan government and Taliban on terms of how to reintegrate those Taliban fighters. Now, why is that? It's quite obvious. Our review points out that a reintegration effort is more likely to have greater chance of success if the formerly hostile parties demonstrate a high-level commitment and a mutual trust that they will allow the fighters to peacefully participate in the program. Without this, if fighters join a reintegration program, they and their families face enormous risks of retribution. And during a war, it is very difficult, if not impossible, in times to provide protection for them. That risk of retribution and insecurity more generally was a key reason that past reintegration programs did not succeed in Afghanistan. Other factors were a very weak economy offering few legal livelihood opportunities to former fighters and limited Afghan government capacity to implement those programs. Additionally, early efforts to demobilize and reintegrate state-allied militias failed in part because U.S. forces were at the same time partnered with those militias for security and other services. U.S. forces' dependence on the militias empowered commanders and groups that were supposed to be disbanding. Based upon our review of Afghan government documents, program evaluations, interviews, and independent studies, we found that past programs did not lead to any significant number of former fighters reintegrating into society, did not weaken the insurgency, and did not reduce violence. If they had, we would not be reading a lot about what's going on in Afghanistan today. Our report also highlights that, especially from 2009 onward, the U.S. viewed reintegration primarily as a tool to fracture and weaken the Taliban. Now, that approach, while we understand that approach, had unintended and damaging consequences. It basically undermined the potential for reintegration efforts to promote actual reconciliation. And as we report, there's no evidence that the reintegration program served to weaken or splinter the Taliban's resolve. Nothing about the current environment, unfortunately, suggests that a renewed program would have any greater chance of success than the past efforts. Moreover, given the legacy of prior programs, a renewed program, we fear, could in fact erode the trust needed to establish a truly lasting peace process. Because the past is often prologue, one goal of evaluating previous reintegration efforts was to derive lessons and recommendations for future efforts, should a more conducive environment present itself. As we have seen in recent weeks, developments in Afghanistan move quite rapidly and quite unexpectedly. The level of diplomatic engagement by the United States with the Taliban and Afghan government in recent months suggests that it would be prudent for all of us, particularly U.S. policymakers, to consider now what reintegration might look like following a peace agreement between the Afghan government and the Taliban, rather than waiting the day after an agreement is signed. In our report, we recommend that the U.S. only consider supporting a reintegration effort if, first, the Afghan government and Taliban sign a peace agreement that provides a framework for reintegration. Secondly, if there is a significant reduction in overall violence. And thirdly, if there is a strong monitoring and evaluation system in place. And I think I only need to highlight the letter that came out of the Department of State today by Secretary of State raising his serious concerns about corruption in Afghanistan as a reason for why you need strong monitoring and evaluation of any program on reintegration. Our report is very clear that any reintegration program, even under the auspices of a political settlement, would still face significant challenges. And one of the biggest problems we highlight is the poor state of the Afghan economy. Joblessness, for example, would present a major hurdle to successful reintegration. Unemployment now stands at 23% overall, with a 30% unemployment rate for the 1/5, 20%, of the Afghan population between the ages of 15 and 24. An estimated 400,000 Afghan youth enter the job market every year. For fighters to come in from the cold and rejoin society, they will need access to a stable job, or they then may return to fighting or enter one of Afghan's many more profitable but illicit economic sectors, such as organized crime, kidnapping, and narcotics trafficking. Additionally, should a peace agreement be reached, some portion of the over 2.7 million Afghan refugees can be expected to return, the vast majority of them now being in Iran and Pakistan. In 2018, the World Bank has already said over 800,000 Afghans returned to Pakistan, from Pakistan and Iran, and more than 700,000 Afghans were internally displaced by drought or conflict. These vulnerable groups will increase the pressure on an already anemic economy and labor market in Afghanistan, as well as on the capacity of the Afghan government and donors to provide social services, create jobs, and deliver humanitarian aid. Adding tens of thousands of armed Afghan or Taliban soldiers, as well as their families and supporters, to the mix will only exacerbate this challenge. It will also be critical that reintegration efforts be directed at not only the Taliban combatants, but also members of state-aligned militias and other armed groups that have been fighting the Taliban. Failing to do so would give the Taliban a rationale for not participating, as they would likely seek to protect themselves against their former rivals. Accordingly, successful reintegration will require continued economic support for Afghanistan from the U.S. and the rest of the donor community. Now, we note approvingly that a number of donors right now, including the United States, are working with the World Bank on plans for enhanced financial and technical support to Afghanistan, with the goal of improving Afghan's economy and its capacity to deliver services post a peace agreement. In a post-settlement scenario, this would support both reintegration and the burgeoning youth population. Nevertheless, and let me emphasize this, just as Secretary Pompeo is emphasizing it in his letter today. Pervasive corruption in the Afghan government institutions, paired with limited capacity, could undermine attempts to deliver tangible benefits and resources to former fighters. As SIGAR's prior work, 7 years of work that I have led for SIGAR, has shown, without adequate oversight and conditionality by the donor community, resources intended for foot soldiers face the real risk of being stolen by corrupt government officials or senior commanders. And if benefits are provided to former fighters but do not also reach the communities they live in, the resentment that follows may also undermine reintegration efforts. In addition, we have to face the reality of the future of the Afghan security forces, the Afghan National Security Force, the police, and the military, over 300,000. That provides a further complication. The Taliban have shown interest in integrating their fighters into the Afghan security forces. I'm not taking sides on that desire, but this would be one of the most contentious issues in any negotiation between the Afghan government and the Taliban, as well as with the U.S. government. Failure to adequately resolve that issue could threaten, again, the implementation of any successful peace agreement between both sides. Again, since U.S. funds will continue, in all likelihood, to support Afghan security forces, robust oversight would be paramount to ensure the successful integration of those adversaries and the successful and safe use of those funds. Now, some reintegration, primarily for Taliban fighters who fight seasonally and are already part of the social fabric of Afghanistan, may occur naturally and will continue, just as it did after 2001. But some research also indicates that many Taliban struggle to imagine a life beyond the insurgency and would want to retain that movement's military power. The potentially tens of thousands of Taliban who do wish to reintegrate will face the obstacles of a weak economy, ongoing insecurity, and local conflicts driven by tribal disputes and unresolved grievances. ISK could also attempt to recruit disgruntled Taliban fighters who find fault with the terms of any peace deal. So in a peace post-settlement scenario, U.S. policymakers must consider the conditions on which they would support and fund reintegration efforts, including whether they should be targeted programs for ex-combatants or whether wider development programming is more appropriate to address the issues they confront. In addition, U.S. and UN sanctions that prohibit assistance from going to certain members of the Taliban and areas they control may need to be revised so that those individuals and areas are not excluded from any economic development or aid. If a peace settlement opens the door for development assistance to reach previously inaccessible populations, the donor community will also face hard questions about how and where to direct that assistance most efficiently. The logic justifying reintegration programs assumes that ex-combatants pose greater security risks than the other vulnerable populations, such as jobless youth. But it is reasonable to assume that millions of unemployed young Afghans will remain at risk for recruitment by criminal groups and terrorist organizations such as ISIS-K. So investment in a reintegration program, therefore, should be appropriately balanced against other development priorities. Finally, as SIGAR has pointed out before, particularly in our high-risk list to Congress that we issued earlier this year, an Afghan political settlement would not end the plagues of insecurity, corruption, or weak government capacity, something that U.S. agencies need to take into account in advance of a successful peace agreement. In conclusion, It has often been said that it is far easier to start a war than to end one, a sentiment that I think successive U.S. and Afghan governments would all agree with. But even if an intra-Afghan political settlement is reached, Afghanistan's problems will not magically disappear the moment the ink dries on an agreement. We have to be realistic. And that's what this report is saying. Let's be realistic. A failure to reintegrate combatants of all stripes into Afghan society will only lead to the continuation of this 40-year cycle we have witnessed that has led to generations of Afghans growing up knowing only death and destruction. And likewise, which has led to many of the Afghan supporters around the world continuing to sacrifice blood and treasure in this distant land. Should a sustainable political settlement be reached, something we all hope for, the success of that agreement will depend in large part on the successful reintegration of the Taliban and other combatants. And as our report's review of reintegration efforts in Colombia and Somalia identify, this is not an easy process. But should the United States support such endeavor, we must learn from past mistakes. We must set reasonable expectations. We must identify and implement best practices. And all of this, I hope, is assisted by the report that we release today. Now, let me end by just saying this. I would be remiss as the SIGAR not to identify the great team which has given you this report. This is an outstanding team. First of all, and I'm going to ask them to rise if that's allowed. Kate Bateman, please stand up. Kate Bateman led the team that produced this report. And her key colleagues was Maryam Jalalzadeh. Maryam? And Maryam, I always mispronounce her last name, but I hope her parents forgive me for my ignorance. Matthew Rubin, where's Matt? Jordan Schurter. Jordan, are you here? In Kabul, okay, good place. Along with Nikolai Kandi Padunov, Tracy Content, Vong Lim, and of course, last but not least, Joe Windrum, who is in charge of our Lessons Learned program. These people will be here today. Some will be at the panel discussion, and others will be around. Please buttonhole them, and if you have any questions, ask them. Let me just say, I've worked in the government for nearly 40 years. Worked on the Hill, worked in the Department of Justice, Department of Commerce, we used to call it Department of Comedy, as well as for Sam Nunn, John Dingell. It's people like that team that makes me proud to be the SIGAR and puts the special in the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. So thank you very much. I do not want to take, you hear enough of me, and I'm just the big mouth for the agency. But I will take a few questions, but I don't want to take my time away from the great panel we have. We have somebody coming in from Afghanistan, actually, I think by the miracles of modern science. So I'll take a few questions if anybody has any questions. Sir. Oh, I'm sorry, I got to speak. Okay, I'll take a few questions, yeah.
Oh, thank you. This is Ahmad Muhibi from Rise to Peace. I closely follow SIGAR, and I use you guys' report for a lot of research. The quick question is, where are you taking all the lessons learned? What's next? Will there be a possible action policy? Will it drive into policy? We see the past 18 years, the great work SIGAR is doing. So what should be done?
Great.
Thank you.
Good. That's a very good question. All of our work, not just the lessons learned, is we try to get Congress to focus on this issue, the administration, and we've been successful. And actually, the Lessons Learned team goes out. Many of them are here today. They have briefed members. We're trying to incorporate these lessons into practice. Ironically, they're not really lessons learned until they're actually adopted, and that's what we're trying to do. And actually, my team's gone to many agencies in the U.S. government. They briefed many people. I remember myself on one of our reports briefing Joe Dunford and his team for almost 2 hours. So we try to get it incorporated into best practices for the future. So that's what we try to do. I think the gentleman right in front of you had his hand up first. So.
Thank you, John. Bill Goodfellow, the Afghanistan Peace Campaign. I'm quite familiar with the peace process in El Salvador, which the UN implemented. It was Oscar Arias' agreement the UN implemented. A little different, though. The FMLN was defeated, as was the FARC in Colombia. That's not the case in Afghanistan with the Taliban. Do you see a role for, if not the UN, some other outside agency? You talked about the need to monitor. I mean, how's this going to work, particularly since the Taliban probably think they are winning rather than defeated? And what role, who does the monitoring that you mentioned?
Well, for U.S. government funding, I think an agency such as SIGAR or the other IGs can do the monitoring, although the first line of monitoring and evaluation, if it's U.S. funds, should be the U.S. agencies. I mean, by the time we come in, an IG comes in, we're like that TV documentary about the police and detectives. You know, there's just a chalk outline of the body. I mean, the money's been stolen. We rarely recover it. But I think there's a role for every government agency. And there's a role for every international agency for strong monitoring and evaluation. And we've harped about that in the past. We've had concerns about how well the UN does a job monitoring and evaluating the LOTFA program in Afghanistan. We've had concerns, and we're going to be starting another audit looking at the World Bank on how they monitor ARTF. And I should say on that, and I highly recommend you read Secretary Palumbo's letter today, because not only is he concerned about corruption, something that we raise, but he's pulled back money from USAID going to the DABS, which is the public utility in Afghanistan, and we have highlighted problems with that utility. We looked at Kajaki, we looked at NEPS, SEPS, about problems there. He also highlights problems going to ARTF, Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund. So there's a role for everybody. It's not just SIGAR's job. It's also Afghanistan's job. Now, in his letter, he also raises concerns about the MEC. We all know Monitoring and Evaluation Committee. There needs to be a monitoring and role for the Afghans. They need to do something. Maybe MEC's not it, but they definitely need a role. So let me do one more question, because otherwise I can talk for hours. I'm an old trial attorney. I used to get paid by the word. So you don't want to use me. Yes, sir, right behind you. I'm sorry, I'm just hitting that side, but I'll ask one more question over there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. During this 7th Lesson Learned report, I'm just wondering if the team had the opportunity to flag or the other factors, as we all know that the Taliban are not self-driven movement, and they do have linkages with other regional players. How do you see reintegration of Taliban in Afghanistan without losing those ties with other players? For example, we have the issue of Iran in the region, and then competition of Saudi Arabia, and then China. I'm just wondering if the team had any views on that.
I'm going to defer to the panel, and Kate Bateman, who's our team lead, is going to be in that panel. They can probably answer that. But we did not look at the peace agreement or the peace process. So I think you're sort of getting in that area. We looked at the prior programs and trying to draw lessons and best practices from that. So maybe, I don't know if we'll be able to answer your question. But let me just ask the last question to somebody on this side of the panel, the room. I hope somebody over there, oh, maybe they don't need to have any questions. Sir, way up there. I'm sorry. I'm forcing you to reach.
Thank you. Alec Bates, IOM. In the absence of a full reintegration program that's supported by the U.S., would there still remain a path for those who seek to defect?
There should be, and I think we talk about that. We expect there to be onesies and twosies coming in. But what we're saying is don't develop and fund a major program if you don't have that peace agreement. That's all we're saying. Yeah, people will, and I think Kate can talk about that. You know, we identify examples of where individuals turned in their gun and then try to get back into the community. But a full-blown program without that peace agreement, without that modicum of security, is not going to work. Thank you very much for those questions. I will be around afterwards, and my staff will be around if you have any others. But again, thank you very much for allowing us to release this report here and to come back and see our friends at the Institute of Peace. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Scott Worden, and I'm the Director of Afghanistan and Central Asia Programs here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. So it's my pleasure to introduce the panel and moderate a discussion between now and 12:30 to talk about some more specific findings and recommendations of the report. I'll just say 2 points of observation on my own. One is the value, as was said earlier, this is the only U.S. government independent report of this area of work in Afghanistan, of reintegration, and the value of documenting that now over an 18-year engagement. The programs they're talking about, some of them are 15 years old. DIAG was going on when I was first in Afghanistan in 2005, and most of the current policymakers have not experienced that, not remembered it, and having the full chronicle of this engagement in one spot is truly a valuable resource. The other thing which I hope the panelists will talk about today, and the way that we structured this panel, is to illustrate some of the contrast between the policy objectives that at the top level drive some of these reintegration programs, for better or for worse, and the ground realities of what are the calculations that Afghans make on the ground, both combatants but also community members, to see whether reintegration is worth taking a risk for, whether it's worth supporting. And there has been a tension between the policy objective and the ground realities. Our panel, which I will now introduce, has extensive ground experience as well as policy experience, and I think can, through their remarks, get at some of those issues. So first on my left is Kate Bateman. She, as was introduced, was the director of this report. She's a supervisory analyst at the Lessons Learned program at SIGAR. And she has also led reports on anti-corruption and counter-narcotics for SIGAR. She worked previously at the Council on Foreign Relations and for the State Department in Kabul and Washington. Hopefully coming up on the screen shortly will be Timur Sharan. He is the Deputy Minister for Policy and Technical Affairs with the Independent Directorate of Local Governance. Good evening to you, Timur. Glad you can join us from Kabul. He previously was a senior policy analyst with the International Crisis Group. He's worked for the Asia Foundation and with Counterpart International. So a civil society background. He's also an academic, having done research in his PhD on local governance and development. Ericka Gaston is second on my left. She is a non-resident fellow at the New America Foundation, as well as the Global Public Policy Institute. Her research has focused, and she's published widely, on local, sub-state, and other hybrid security forces, aka militias, in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Previously, Ericka worked here, leading the Afghanistan and Yemen rule of law programs for the U.S. Institute of Peace. And then finally, on the far end is Johnny Walsh. He's a senior expert here at USIP on Afghanistan. He spent 10 years as a diplomat with the State Department, focusing on Afghanistan as well as the Middle East. He has time at UN for the State Department in New York, and he is focusing on the Afghanistan peace process for us. So without further ado, let's first hear from Kate.
Thank you, Scott. We're so grateful to USIP and to Timur, Ericka, and Johnny for taking the time and bringing your expertise to this discussion. I'd like to pick up on a few points that Mr. Sopko raised and also say a bit more about our other key recommendations in the report. The report answers two main questions. First, how should U.S. policymakers think about the reintegration of ex-combatants in Afghanistan in the current environment of an ongoing insurgency? And second, how should they think about reintegration in a future hypothetical scenario where there may be, hopefully, a peace agreement between the Afghan government and the Taliban? So to answer the first question of the current environment of insurgency, we can look at the track record of those reintegration programs that were implemented from 2003 to 2016. As Scott mentioned, I mean, during that time, there was continuously some program in place. Two of those programs were targeting state-aligned militias and illegal armed groups, and that was a somewhat of a different context because those were implemented in the wake of the Bonn Agreement of 2001. But the second two programs were PTS and APRP, for some of you who may know. Those were targeting Taliban insurgents. So those were, and they were undertaken, obviously, during the insurgency. Our report found that none of these programs worked to successfully reintegrate any significant number of former fighters. Surely there are anecdotes and there are surely cases of people fighters returning to civilian life, but we found no evidence that the programs had a significant role in that outcome or that they successfully reintegrated large numbers of fighters. Particularly for the two programs that did target Taliban insurgents, there were three main problems. One is vetting. How do you determine that someone is an actual fighter in this complex environment? How do you determine that they're genuine in their desire to stop fighting? Two, as Mr. Sopko related, the problem of protecting your program participants. If you are an actual fighter, the basic thing that you will need is a security guarantee for you and your family. And yet Taliban fighters were facing threats from, if you did want to reintegrate, you were still facing threats from the Taliban, your former comrades, from coalition and Afghan forces who might not know and might not care that you have reintegrated, and also from other members of the community who may be seeking revenge against you for abuse committed by you or your unit. So with all these threats, coalition and Afghan forces did take steps to try to protect Taliban who were reintegrating, but it was not enough. Over 200 were killed just during the second program, APRP. And it was very difficult to sync targeting lists among many different actors, Afghan forces, NATO forces, US military, and US and Afghan intelligence. A third problem was tracking and monitoring insurgents. It's very hard to know if they have stayed out of the fight or indeed if they even ever left the fight. There were other implementation challenges as well, including dispersing and spending money and developing the Afghan government capacity that was needed to manage the programs. So ultimately, we wanted these to be Afghan-led programs. This is just more reasoning behind that key recommendation we make that the U.S. should not support a renewed program during the current insurgency. On the other hand, we do recommend that if and when the Afghan government and the Taliban enter negotiations, the State Department should encourage both sides to negotiate and to figure out how former fighters will be integrated into society. It is Afghans, including the Taliban. The US is gonna have to be okay with the fact the Taliban will have a vote, a very big vote in this, most likely. They will ultimately decide the framework for reintegration. And if the details are not worked out during negotiations, then implementation, which is already gonna be extraordinarily hard, will be even more difficult and at risk of failure. Our report also makes a broader recommendation to the US government that state, USAID, and DoD should designate an existing office to lead and advise on these issues, on reintegration issues. There's a real lack of expertise and leadership in the US government on this issue, and we think it's time that we build some in-house expertise. So shifting gears to a hypothetical intra-Afghan political settlement. As Andrew and Mr. Sopko highlighted, it might be very difficult to imagine such a settlement in place that could open the door for real reintegration, but it doesn't make it any less urgent. With the numbers of people dying and the chances of a viable process are probably still better today than they have been in 18 years. And then last but not least, I think no one would argue that the US government does not plans and prepares too much for how to sustain a peace agreement. I think our military friends would agree with that as well. Admittedly, there's a lot we don't know about a potential future peace agreement. We don't know what the power structure will be, the degree to which the Taliban and Afghan security forces will remain cohesive and not fracture. We don't know if all Afghan ethnic groups and political elites will back an agreement, and we don't know the scale of an international presence that might persist. And all of those factors and more will, of course, shape the prospects for reintegration. But despite those uncertainties, our report offers parameters for how the US and Afghan governments could approach reintegration while planning for the very big risks and challenges that they'll face. So we point out that broad development programs can help ex-combatants because the process of reintegration will not entirely depend on whether there's a targeted reintegration program in place. We think it's important to distinguish between the actual process, some of which can happen naturally, and versus a program that's designed to facilitate that process. We need to ensure that development assistance reaches these people and their communities, and hence our recommendation on US sanctions, that we should ensure US assistance can reach these people and the areas that the Taliban now controls. Mr. Sopko also described our recommendation that the US should consider supporting a reintegration program only if 3 minimum conditions are in place. I just want to highlight this one. First, those conditions are that first, a peace agreement sets a framework for reintegration. Second, that a large reduction in violence occurs to enable assistance to reach former fighters in these communities. And 3, that a strong monitoring and evaluation system is in place so that we know if the program is working or not and can make adjustments. Finally, our report highlights several actions that the Afghan government could consider for a future reintegration effort. For instance, the need to include not only Taliban. We are not only talking about Taliban fighters because there is a proliferation of armed groups in Afghan society, which I'm hoping Ericka can speak more to. But they must not be the only ones included in a reintegration effort. There must be, other militias must be included as well. And not doing this would give the Taliban a rationale for not participating, as they would likely look to protect themselves from former rivals. And any future effort, as the IG also underscored, must ensure that communities that are receiving former fighters be part of the decision-making process around reintegration. And that's a key lesson from the broader literature, that the communities themselves cannot be angry and resentful about advantages given to former combatants that are perceived to be unfair. We also suggest that international DDR experts could advise Afghan negotiators on reintegration. They could come from both sides of past conflicts in other countries, like Colombia or Northern Ireland, to give the Afghan negotiators some sense of what's happened in their countries as well. So I will stop there, and I look forward to my fellow panelists' comments and reactions on this issue. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much. Timur, we'll turn it over to you. Thanks again for joining us from Kabul, and welcome your reactions to the report.
Thank you very much, Scott. Greetings to you all from Kabul. Let me begin by congratulating SIGAR and the team on this timely and relevant report on the reintegration of the Taliban fighters. Overall, I think the report's key recommendations and lessons are fundamentally solid, but it needs some fine-tuning for future programming. And let me emphasize a number of points from a local governance perspective. First of all, given the local dynamics of power politics in Afghanistan, where local strongmen and elites are powerful and they control parts of the Afghan state, and they have been able, in post-2001 Afghanistan, to promote an expansive political networks and accumulate wealth through illegality. It's important to ensure that reintegration does not become, as it did in 2002 through DDR, a process of resource distribution for powerful commanders and leaders to expand their power. Secondly, it's important to get the buy-in of local elites and power brokers early on, as early as possible, possibly as early as the peace negotiation period, to ensure that they do not act as spoilers. Therefore, we must pursue a process-based mechanism that allows consensus building at the local level and ensures inclusivity. And the report clearly points out that it is important to have the shared political will at all levels of the state. Thirdly, the report rightly points out the importance of economic, social, and political aspects of reintegration. And I want to emphasize the latter two, which seems to be often missing, less given attention to in the previous reintegration programs. We cannot simply quantify reintegration through short-term economic benefits, and should not limit it to simply about numbers. For social integration, it is important to understand Afghanistan's societal structure and norms is based on a sense of honor, dignity, and having a voice, which is crucial for any successful reintegration program. And let me give you an example. A year and a half ago, I was in the north and we captured a Taliban fighter. After a brief conversation with him, we found out that he was a former Jamiat fighter and that he had joined the Taliban. When we asked him the reason, eventually he told us that for 23 years he was a jihadi and that he had a purpose, but that he felt powerless in the complexity of the state machinery that has taken place and the level of complicated local dynamics. Linked to this, I think, is the issue of the notion of honor and justice in Afghanistan, which cannot be understood in the Western sense individually. Honor and dignity is felt collectively, and that is incorporated through the extended family to the tribe and community as a whole. Early this week, I was in Kandahar, in Panjwai district of Kandahar, a district that was that the Taliban 2 years ago had a full control. And I was paying respect. I was visiting the district governor's office, and I was paying respect to the father of our deputy governor, who was killed through a suicide attack at the governor's compound. Somebody pointed out that the guy who's sitting there is a former Taliban fighter, and he had lost 2 members of his family, but he has been reintegrated. And I asked him a few questions. I realized that he had the village support, that he wasn't stigmatized, and that was a key element of that successful reintegration. On the plane back to Kabul, I met a former Taliban who claimed to be used to work in Mullah Omar's office. And then he had gone to the province to campaign for one of the candidates. He explained to me thoroughly the next day over lunch that the reason he was successfully incorporated through the local mechanisms was because he had the tribal support. Which clearly highlights the importance of notion of honor, dignity, and giving a voice to these fighters. And that brings me to the 4th point, that we must take and employ a community-based approach to reintegration.
Technology works until it doesn't. Go ahead, Timur. You cut out for a second, but please continue.
Maybe I make the 4th point then, which is that we must employ a community-based approach to reintegration. And to do this, we must utilize existing Afghan state structure at the village and district level. Now, the Citizen Charter Program structure can be very useful. The CDCs, Community Development Councils, the cluster CDCs, which combines 4 to 8 villages together, and the subcommittees can be a very important entry point for building trust between the communities and the ex-combatants, create an excellent platform for village and cluster level reconciliation and social dialogue, and more importantly, help us with the vetting process, monitoring and evaluation, something that colleagues have already mentioned is important. Fifth, on the political representation, it's important to give them voice, agency, and ensure that they are politically represented. What needs to be included in any framework of peace agreement among the Afghans is the importance of some sort of election at district level. In the current constitution, the district council election hasn't happened, but that will ensure that ex-combatants can compete for office. At the village level, Citizen Charter Program provides an excellent mechanism of representation. 50% of women are represented through the council, and at 49% of them are in leadership positions at the village level. It's the district level that is the missing link for us. And Colombia is a good example, again, not my area of expertise, where I've been told the sunrise and sunset closet in the peace deal can be adopted at the district level, where we can adopt for the district council elections. My sixth point, the importance, I cannot emphasize through my work experience in the last 2.5 years for the government, the importance of dispute resolution mechanism in place. Right now, unfortunately, there is a mismatch and alignment between roles and responsibilities, and so many actors are involved. A clarity on that, and adopting community jirgas and town halls, which is something that we are trying to do at IDLG right now, piloting it, is an important mechanism through which we can do dispute resolution. And finally, fifthly, maybe justice and governance go together. A good entry point for the Taliban could be, in the justice sector, could be the establishment of mobile courts, where they have shown interest that they're willing to engage in this sector. On the economic integration, colleagues have pointed out rightly the weak Afghan economy and so forth. Let me emphasize that in the last joint coordination and monitoring board meeting in Kabul, the Afghan government proposed an initiative for reintegration, which had two components. In the short term, we proposed to deliver short-term jobs by rebuilding and maintaining key infrastructures through the Citizen Charter Program. At the medium level, we proposed that we allocate district grants fund at the districts for infrastructure development, including roads, bridges, and the 388 district governance complexes that we are trying to establish through the Effective Governance NPP. But maybe finish here by saying that over the last 18 years, our economic strategy has been one of, and encouraged by our international colleagues, one of poverty reduction. What essentially we need to do is shift from poverty reduction to economic growth strategies. And there are a number of steps that we are taking, which I would be happy to discuss, those that could be a part of a comprehensive post-peace plan economic growth for Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Timur. Let me turn to Ericka.
Great, thanks. I'm just going to pick up on a couple threads that both Kate and Timur put out. I want to talk a little bit about some of these issues of power dynamics, and then briefly on what reintegration might do in terms of groups that are currently aligned with pro-government forces, and kind of how those incentives would affect the current peace process. So I think first what this report really lays out and is worth reading in detail is all of the many pitfalls that happen with past DDR processes. More often, instead of actually reducing the number of fighters or drawing down the sources of conflict, they became just another source of aid spoils. So those that were appointed into positions overseeing some of these disarmament initiatives, they were often a source of patronage. A lot of the funds were diverted, sometimes to prop up sort of existing networks of armed groups and fighters, as Timur pointed out. There were a lot of loopholes for many of the fighters who should have gone through, particularly in a lot of the pro-government forces. And then on the Taliban side, you had a lot of faux fighters coming in, or sort of those who were, you know, farmers, or sometimes were even aligned with some of the pro-government factions who were trading it in to get different economic packages. The Taliban who did join, often they were sort of disgruntled by the economic incentives that were offered or by the loss of status. Many of them were then subsequently attacked, and there was a lack of protection, which is also something the report, you know, addresses. And then as soon as the fighting ticked back, they went back in. So these were sort of the litany of past problems with all the past DDR in Afghanistan. And that is why I think this report really draws out that it's very hard to find anyone that has good things to say about the successful record of disarmament and reintegration in Afghanistan. I will just pull out one quote from the report, which I thought was a really good summary, that even the UNDP's own assessment of its APRB program was that it was, quote, overly ambitious and producing no satisfactory results. The World Bank has specifically declined to earmark funds for this in its next economic program, because it found that the evidence and experience in Afghanistan is that setting aside specific economic incentives for fighters presents opportunities for corruption, quote, fueling further violence. So I think this is sort of the shadow and why you get such pointed recommendations from SIGAR and warning signs about the reintegration. There is, of course, a narrative that this should be pursued now because the conditions have changed. That if you have peace happening on the table and you have US now more supportive of reintegration than it was in the past, that you have more prospects for it to exist. But I think what this report also highlights is that the same conditions that scuttled a lot of the past disarmament and demobilization processes are still very much in play. So assuming that the peace process gets back on the track, nobody thinks the estimated 40,000 to 60,000 Taliban fighters, that all of them will take part in a disarmament process. A lot of them will still continue fighting on. In addition, there are any number of armed groups who are not part of that peace deal. And so what you're looking at is not the sort of peace dividends that everyone hopes for that will then result in a smoother disarmament process and less of the sort of opt-outs and remobilization that happened before, but a period where you still have the same security pressures that were an issue in past rounds. Then more importantly, and this is what I really want to talk about, is that stretching back to the original bond negotiations, a major blockage to both DDR and to Taliban reintegration has come not from the Taliban or these other armed groups, but from groups that were aligned with and within the Afghan government. So a common question that you hear is, what do the Taliban want to get out of peace process or out of negotiations? What do Taliban fighters look for in a reintegration package? What jobs do they want? What sort of economic package would they accept? But I think an equally important or more question is not what the Taliban fighters would want, but what some of these pro-government factions and fighters would want. Most in the past have seen DDR processes and billets within the Afghan security forces as a resource, as a source of patronage and power for the local fighter, as a source of jobs. And they are unwilling, likely, to give that up, particularly to give it up and give a greater share to the Taliban. So I think that creates a real prospect going forward that as soon as a disarmament or reintegration plan is put on the table, it creates a lot of incentives or spoilers in the ongoing peace process. They are already there, of course, with all the broader discussions about power sharing, but it sort of ratchets it up a notch. So that's one major risk, is that putting this sort of large reintegration package or idea on the table could affect the prospects for peace negotiations, and particularly misalign incentives within an intra-Afghan peace process. The second is that the current ideas, to the extent that there is some talk about what would a reintegration proposal look like, one of the most common ideas is not only to put out some sort of economic incentives or packages, but also that the Taliban will want some berths within Afghan security forces. Now, most people that are considering this question, they say, well, we don't necessarily want them in the army because we want to retain a strong, coherent army. Don't want them in the police because we don't want the Taliban that don't, at least publicly for the moment, support the Afghan constitution to be in charge of law enforcement. So the kind of third and leftover option tends to be, well, maybe we could give them a position within one of the different local forces. So the Afghan local police or the new ANA territorial force, or potentially some other sort of quasi-state force. This is also really problematic because these forces, while in some communities they've been able to nestle well and they respond to community checks, they've had a really mixed record. So I mean, that best case scenario has only been in at most a third of the sites. In a lot of areas, what they've done is they've sort of been an enabling force for militias to get on payroll, for different criminal or other illicit economic groups to take further control of power in a local area. They've been predatory, they've tended to fight with other groups, and so they've been a source of conflict. So the idea of pumping the Taliban in through this, I mean, one, it's not clear that the Taliban would want that as opposed to a force that would be fully synced in and with the central state of power. But it's also, what's really likely to happen is one of two scenarios where you would put those into local forces. They would kind of exacerbate some of the existing problems in some of the divided communities and possibly lead to more conflict. And in other areas, say that are already de facto under Taliban control, what you would have would look not a lot like reintegration, but more just like ceding provinces to the Taliban. So those are kind of the current issues, and I want to pull out just looping towards the conclusion here so that Johnny can get a word in. I think the quote that I took away from this report was, "A program done poorly and in adverse conditions may prove worse than none at all." You know, in this case, something is worse than nothing, I think, until all of these other conditions that they mentioned are figured out. Now, the rebuttal that you're going to get is, well, what do you want to do with all this? What I would say is focus on all of the other fighters that are currently out there, not under full government control, creating a lot of violence and instability at a local level, and would anyway have to be part of an eventual disarmament and reintegration program. So the current Afghan security force numbers are about 300,000. It's not sustainable. Everybody thinks that, you know, you would have to reduce those by at least 50 to 100,000. What happens with all of those fighters? There's all of these different local force units, many with unsustainable source of funding. So say you need to find a new berth for 30,000 Afghan local police in the next year. That's an important reintegration priority. Not to mention all of there's a section in the report talking about the Hezbollah Islamic ex-combatants who are still waiting for that deal to come through. So I think there's a lot that's already on the plate that needs to be sorted out in terms of disarmament and reintegration without sort of poisoning the well of future peace talks with these, you know, half-baked ideas. Okay, I'll turn it to Johnny now.
Thanks, Ericka. Johnny, you're last.
Thank you. I'll try to be very quick so we can include some questions. First, my congratulations to SIGAR on what, for me, was kind of a cathartic report. I think identifying some of the real problems that frustrated many of us in government over the years. My own journey with reintegration, my own journey with Afghanistan started when I served there in 2010 in Kandahar, kind of the height of the troop surge, enormous resources to throw at every problem. And during that time, there was this guy named Torjan who came in and said he wanted to reintegrate and that he was a significant commander. It was very hard to prove or disprove that claim. We thought he probably was. He wasn't one of the most important people we were looking for. And the short version of that experience was we did reintegrate him. He came with about 25 or 30 people in his tail, which was often how it worked. It did start a small movement of imitators, probably more legit than fake. But it was virtually impossible to provide for all these people, even with the unlimited resources. They ended up being housed like in the governor's compound or in other existing ad hoc facilities. And even though there was maybe the stirrings of momentum visible of the sort that was so elusive, it died within a few months because you couldn't provide for more than that tiny critical mass and really ensure their security. And eventually Torjan was in fact assassinated. So it was, to me, representative. I just want to make 3 quick points, one each on the past, present, and future, let's say. I think the point on the past is that, as we've all made today, it proved basically impossible to split or really weaken the Taliban through reintegration or a defection strategy. It was not an insane thing to try, but I do think our effort to do so often undercut our larger efforts to reach peace in Afghanistan. And that included, it was for reasons we've discussed, the problem of the same person who reintegrates 7 times and was never a Taliban in the first place, the fact that we couldn't seriously provide for any large number of reintegrees against a movement that had a very substantial ability to assassinate them, the fact that the Taliban are an extremely cohesive movement that has existed for 25 years without ever experiencing a split that meant anything on the battlefield. And the fact that our very plain, not at all hidden efforts to split the group made it hard, I wouldn't overstate this point, but made it harder to convince them that we wanted a top-down peace with them, which was, it's a different discussion, but was a much more viable way to get to peace in Afghanistan. The point on the present is that you may have noticed we've just had a significant setback in the top-down peace process. For better or worse, I've been working on this peace process since 2010. There have been other such setbacks. They almost always lead to a period of soul-searching and out-of-the-box options for how else we could get to a more peaceful outcome. And that conversation almost always includes a reversion to the discussion of could we spawn mass defections or could we split the group? Happened after talks broke down in 2012, happened after the Doha office closed abruptly in 2013. I think it happened in the early period of the South Asia strategy when we were optimistic about the battlefield. In fact, I would speculate that's one of the reasons the command asked SIGAR to take on this problem. I would just say it is good to have creative thinking. It is not good to hang our hopes on what we have already defined as hopeless in a more clear-headed moment of thinking, as SIGAR has led for all of us. And so we could talk about whether the best way forward is to revive the top-down, the Doha peace process, or to try something else. But we should not be tempted to revisit the idea that some low-level campaign of attrition will just wear the Taliban down. It truly won't. And then finally, the point for the future is that if a top-down process does get back on track, I mean, I commend SIGAR for saying, basically as the first item in every list of conclusions or recommendations, that mid-conflict reintegration might be hopeless, at least as far as the Taliban are concerned, but post-conflict reintegration is crucial. I would go a step beyond that and say this is one issue that in an intra-Afghan negotiation, we, the international community, may need to want it more than the parties do. And the reason I say that is we've done a fair amount of research on what the different Afghan parties, including the Taliban, would like to see in a final agreement. They will often have a sort of minimalist view of what's necessary. I think the government, because sometimes people on the government side will look at it more from the lens of how can development programs organically integrate people, and the Taliban, because they don't believe or want to acknowledge that fighters want a handout from the government. However, this is a country with a huge employment crisis. There's some sobering numbers of people in the Taliban ecosystem included in this report. Justosi estimates as many as 200,000 if you include every category, which is totally possible. Failing to seriously provide for these people, even if the parties are tentatively willing to go minimalist at the outset, that's the formula by which ISIS or its future functional equivalent is able to recruit a lot of them, either who oppose the peace process in the first place or who over time get left behind by it. And so I think the recommendations for making post-conflict reintegration work will have their most important moment if and when there's a serious deal.
Great, thank you all. Really a rich discussion and lots to talk about. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and so let me just move directly to the audience and wait for the microphone comes. We'll start with the woman in the back.
Thank you very much. I was part of the UNDP team that evaluated that program. And in addition to all the things that you said, I think there are two other issues. One is the mismatch between the vocational training and then the actual jobs that are there. And second, the most important thing is that donors left. This was a program that was actually supported by President Karzai. When the donors went against the president, they basically stopped funding it. And so one of the main things was when the people who had reintegrated were expecting some money, and then they were left out. And then the Taliban came to them and said, "You remember, traitor, now we kill you either now or you come and fight with us in Kunduz." And then when the Kunduz was taken, a number of the people who had been on the list were the ones who were killed. But anyway, this was the past. The question I have for the future is about the communities. I think that we have a big dilemma. Do we securitize aid and then we say, communities that are going to reintegrate, are we going to get them more money? Or are we going to actually assume that communities are behind these? What Timur said was actually quite interesting. He said that some of these people said that they had the support of their communities. So are we going to look at the communities as kind of the support system for the Taliban or not? And very quickly, another question is, can we envisage a kind of a paramilitary organization to fight Islamic State Khorasan province in the future, made out of some of these Taliban? Thank you.
Let me ask the panelists to keep in mind the questions. In the interest of time, well, take a few and then give several panelists the opportunity to respond. I saw a hand in the back, the gentleman on the top.
Thank you so much. I am Jalil Jilani, Senior Fellow, USIP. I would tend to agree with Taimur that there are different categories of fighters. Some are ideologically motivated, some are motivated by a desire to take revenge for the wrong committed to them. Some are lured by money, and others they join insurgency because of the fear factor. I was wondering if the report suggests the same recipe to integrate all kinds of Taliban fighters, or there are different recipes involved besides provision of justice and end to corruption. Thank you.
And maybe hand the microphone to your left for one more question.
Hi, Doug Brooks, Afghan American Chamber of Commerce. If the Taliban are on board in terms of a peace agreement, then one of the biggest manpower sinks would, of course, be private security, because you're still going to need security protecting any sort of investment in Afghanistan. So it's fairly easy to take soldiers and Taliban or whatever, retrain them, take away the assault rifles and give them shotguns and pistols and put them to work as private security. You still have many other reasons you need security, ISIS and others. So it just seems to me that there's a huge opportunity in the case of Afghanistan to essentially re-employ these people, retrain them, and put them to work fairly quickly. That's just a comment.
Thank you. Timur, I hope you were able to hear those comments, a few on the community role. Maybe we can start with you to address whichever points you would like, and then I'll go to the other panelists.
Thank you so much. One of the key lessons that I have learned in the last 2.5 years is how important communities are, not only as a source of protection, support, but also as a mechanism through which a lot of disputes are resolved at the local level. And as Mr. Jalil Jilani pointed out, we need to differentiate between different categories of the fighters. There are some ideologues, but a lot of them have strong grievances. And this is a country that had historical grievances based on land, water management, and so forth. The current state structure is fundamentally flawed in a sense that it keeps everything in Kabul, and it doesn't empower enough the local state administrations to resolve disputes. We did a basic survey a few months ago. Around 75% of our district governors' time spent on dispute resolution, all sorts of disputes. And they've been very creative in resolving a lot of these disputes. But a lot of these disputes are not contained at the local level, which leads to exacerbation at provincial level, at the national level. A tribal dispute between two tribes in Uruzgan can lead to almost collapse of the state in that province because we are failing to contain conflict at the village level, at the district level, at the provincial level. So I think it's important that we support and introduce and empower those in terms of authorities and responsibilities, district level administrations, to be able to resolve those sorts of disputes. And by empowering those in any reintegration effort, I think they will be playing a key role in terms of successfully reintegrating fighters who could be part of different categories of the Taliban. And the second issue I want to link is this connection between justice and governance. That we need to be successful on the justice front, and to be successful means that we need to rely on informal justice and find ways to combine and merge the formal and informal, and effectively utilize existing mechanisms such as the local jirga system and others. We can in Afghanistan be very creative in resolving some of these issues in relation to political representation. I personally believe that a more Afghan model of political representation can work much better, more successfully than direct election in Afghanistan, for instance. We haven't organized district council elections because we have said it's expensive, because we have said it's going to take a lot of effort. But the reality is we can easily do that indirectly and give voices to people who are disenfranchised. What I mean by that, we have village elders. Imagine if a district has 80 to 100 village elders, we can always bring them every 2 years to the district, and then they could deliberate within a jirga for a week or so, and then choose their district governor or their district council representatives. But we haven't been relying on Afghan-led mechanism through which we could do all of this, and we haven't enough empowered communities and local administrative units to be able to effectively overcome some of these challenges and be able to successfully reintegrate and reduce grievances.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just give each of the panelists a chance to respond to those questions before we close.
Can you restate? I didn't catch the second two questions, not about community.
I can take a shot at something if you partly in response to the question of whether there could be a paramilitary force against ISIS, and partly into the response in response to the question about sort of rehatting Taliban as private security companies or something like that. I think it's hard to know in advance exactly what role is going to be the right one in a fundamentally changed Afghanistan by the time we reach this hoped-for post-conflict moment. My personal view is that it will be virtually impossible to provide for what I think is the largest insurgency in the world without significant use of the tool that they become security forces of some kind. Ericka has been as articulate and forceful as anyone out there on the dangers of doing that, and she's right on every point that she makes. I think nonetheless that given the absence of other ready economic alternatives and the real peril to any possible agreement if there isn't quick employment for people who know how to fight, and I would add to that the non-existent chance that they will actually turn in their weapons. I just don't see a world where that is the outcome of a peace process. Some form of responsible program to integrate Talibs into the armed forces. There are different models for how that's done, potentially with an ISIS component, I think is inevitable to making a process work. And I just hope when we come down to making those choices that we're kind of heeding the warnings to the greatest extent possible that some of the most articulate critics of past programs have put out into the public debate.
I'll just add on to that very briefly. I think certainly there could be some that join the private sector as security guards, and there's an important distinction in private security companies between those that are filling purely security roles and those that are sort of more adventurous or feeding into other trends within Afghanistan. So that's an important distinction. I would be a little bit careful because that issue of sort of the revolving door between folks that were taken out of other fighting groups through DDR programs and just given another job as private security companies, that was a major issue in why particularly some of the pro-government forces programs failed. So I think that would be worth not repeating that mistake and giving more thought to that while recognizing that that is an industry that will likely continue in Afghanistan. And then just a quick follow-up on the point about paramilitary groups versus ISK. I think, yeah, possibly that's That's I think that's already happening now. So in the last 1.5 to 2 years push in Nangarhar, you've not only had sort of the paramilitary forces, the ALP has already existed there, but that was the first priority for the new territorial force. NDS has been really making a cottage industry of uprising forces there. And then there's a lot of evidence that, there's a sort of quid pro quo of allowing the Taliban to also take on, so a sort of almost de facto alliance. I guess if I were going to try and play an optimist of somewhere where I would think that integrating Taliban to work with local forces might have a chance of not provoking conflict in a mixed environment, it might be where they had a common enemy for the time that they were fighting it. Although I still wouldn't be prepared to commit to that being a really sustainable DDR solution for the future.
Kate, I'll give you the last word, but I wonder if I can also just direct some of Timur's comments your way and see what did your research and the report say about who should be leading this effort? Because I've heard from Timur that this is really a political and a governance problem, and yet so many of our programs treat it as a military problem. And I wonder whether you have any reactions to that, as well as whatever final thoughts you may have.
Well, to first just continue briefly the conversation on this, what is security force reform, forces reform, for want of a better term, look like potentially? We try to, I think as Mr. Sopko also alluded to, and we're not taking sides here, and we understood the sensitivities of trying to predict what it might look like, but we also wanted to underscore that we need to be realistic, that it is in cases where an insurgent force integrates into state security forces, that is usually in a case where the government's been victorious. And if there's been a military stalemate for a decade, and in all likelihood, we will be looking at former fighters from many different factions integrating into something new. And that may not be called reintegration. It may be in Colombia, the FARC said, we are not going to use the government's reintegration agency. It had actually become a ministry. We're not going to use this agency for reintegration after the 2016 peace deal. We're going to rename the agency, essentially, call it reincorporation. And then they established provincial, couple layers of subnational committees that had Colombian government representatives, FARC representatives, to jointly work on reintegration issues. So, I mean, maybe now the peace deal is fraying, but maybe there is some instruction for Afghanistan there. But to your question on who might be in charge of a reintegration effort? Well, the mantra in the development community, I think, and I think this post-peace agreement, I think that a broad reintegration effort, if there is one that's distinguished from the general development assistance package, I think the mantra is that it must be host nation government-led, and it probably would be, and we say it should be. There should be host nation government leadership. This is their effort, and Afghans need to be in charge. But at the same time, we have to be realistic about their capacity and the corruption challenges, and it would ultimately be international money, most likely. So we would have the prerogative to put in place some conditionality and some measures of oversight to try to mitigate the risks that we know are there.
Great. This is a conversation we could certainly continue for a while, but we have unfortunately come to the end of our time. Thank you all for attending, and those that are watching online, thank you for joining us. And please join me in a round of applause for our excellent panel.